Welcome, everyone. And as always, I am Daniel, or as some of you may know me as Xanaris, your DM for Legion, every Thursday here at Frankly I Don't Give a Fuck. Today, as per usual, and every other Sunday, I've come to bring you something wicked, where we're going to go and talk about the immortal love story of Carl Tanzler and his would-be bride, Maria Elena de Hoyos. Now, before we start, as always, we do like to do a little bit of decompressing. I want to go and take a moment and speak to all of you from the heart and go and tell you this story is going to be a lot. So I go and I ask that you take a moment and really sit, relax, take a moment. I'm going to be giving a little bit of trigger warnings today. There's going to be a little bit of body horror. There's going to be a lot that's said and done here that may bother you. So if things like death, grave robbing, and the like bother you, this may not be the episode for you. But before we get into all of that, I want to go and say, welcome to our channel. Frankly, I don't give a fuck. We have a plethora of things here that we would like to go and talk to all of you about. And segments. Left and right, we've got map making, we have gameplay, we have role playing, and sometimes we're just here chatting. Please feel free to go and give us a stop by and take a look at all the devastatingly wonderful things that we create for you, because we truly are here for you. Now, before we begin, as always, we will take a moment and do a little bit of decompressing with me. That decompressing today is going to constitute a reading chapter 4 of Winnie the Pooh, the 1922 book, I believe. Let me go and check, because I always go and say the wrong one. Give me just a sec as I open up everything. This is actually the very first book of Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. And this is also in public domain. So before we start in all of the oddness of Carl Tanzler, I want to sit with you. I want to tell all of you to go and grab something warm to drink, or maybe just a little bit of water like myself, and listen to my sonorous voice as I go and I read to you chapter 4 of Winnie the Pooh. And when we're done there, I will begin to go and talk to you about the immortal love story of Carl Tanzler. But first, let us go and talk about chapter 4, in which Eeyore loses a tail and Pooh finds one. The old gray donkey Eeyore stood by himself in a thistly corner of the forest, his front feet well apart, his head on one side, and thought about things. Sometimes he thought sadly to himself, why? And sometimes he thought, wherefore? And sometimes he thought, inasmuch as which? And sometimes he didn't quite know what he was thinking about. So when Winnie the Pooh came stomping along, Eeyore was very glad to be able to stop thinking for a little, in order to say, how do you do, in a gloomy manner to him. And how are you? Said Winnie the Pooh. Eeyore shook his head from side to side. Not very how, he said. I don't seem to have felt at all how for a long time. Dear, dear, said Pooh. I'm sorry about that. Let's have a look at you. So Eeyore stood there, gazing sadly at the ground, and Winnie the Pooh walked all round him once. Why, what's happened to your tail? He said in surprise. What has happened to it? Said Eeyore. It isn't there. Are you sure? Well, either tail is there or isn't there. You can't make a mistake about it. And yours isn't there. Then what is? Nothing. Let's have a look, said Eeyore. And he turned slowly round to the place where his tail had been a little while ago. And then finding that he couldn't catch it up, He turned around the other way until he came back to where he was at first. Then he put his head down and looked between his front legs, and at last he said with a long, sad sigh, "I believe you're right." "Of course I'm right," said Pooh. "That accounts for a good deal," said Eeyore gloomily. "It explains everything, no wonder." "You must have left it somewhere," said Winnie the Pooh. "Somebody must have taken it. And Eeyore, how like them," he added after a long silence. Pooh felt he ought to say something helpful about it, but didn't quite know what, so he decided to do something helpful instead. "Eeyore," he said solemnly, "I, Winnie the Pooh, will find your tail for you." "Thank you, Pooh," answered Eeyore. "You're a real friend." And he said, "Not like some," he said. Oh, poor Eeyore. I didn't know that Eeyore was actually so sad in the book. Huh. So Winnie the Pooh went off to find Eeyore's tail. It was a fine spring morning in the forest as he started out. Little soft clouds played happily in the blue sky, skipping from time to time in front of the sun as if they had come to put it out, and then sliding away suddenly so that the next night might have his turn. Through them and between them the sun shone bravely, and a copse which had worn its furs all year round seemed old and dowdy, now besides the new green lace where the beeches had put on so prettily. Through copse and spiny marched Bear, down open slopes of gorse and heather, over rocky beds of streams, up steep banks of sandstone into the heather again, and so at last, tired and hungry, to the 100-acre wood. For was the 100-acre wood that Owl lived. "And if anyone knows anything about anything," said Bear to himself, "it's Owl who knows something about something," he said. "Or my name's not Winnie the Pooh," he said. "Which it is," he added. So there you are. Owl lived at the Chestnuts, an old residence of great charm, which was grander than anybody else, or seemed so to Bear, because it had a knocker and a pull bell. Underneath the knocker there was a notice which said, "Please ring if a ransom is required." Underneath the bell pull there was a notice which said, "Please knock if a answer is not required." These notices had been written by Christopher Robin, who was the only one in the forest who could spell. For Owl, wise though he was in many ways, able to read and write and spell his own name, Wol, W-O-L, yet somehow went all to pieces over delicate words like measles and buttered toast. Winnie the Pooh read the two notices very carefully, first from left to right, and afterwards, in case he had missed some of it, from right to left, and then to make quite sure. Now that we are here together, let's take a moment and let us all prick our thumbs for something wicked this way now comes. Karl Tanzler, German born, also known as Count Karl von Kossel, was born on February 8th, 1877. Karl was an odd man, and that's putting it lightly. He was born in Dresden, Germany, and having grown up in Germany, he talks about his birth in odd ways during the war and things like that. But you see, Karl believed himself to be more than what he was. He actually grew up in a castle in Dresden, and he took to science and things like that quite quickly. In his own writing, quote, "While my whole life thus deranged, I lived for a time as a recluse amongst the rubble of my laboratory, using the airplane which I built for Elena as a shelter." Now, this is in the beginning that he begins to talk about all of his dreadfulness that happened between him and Elena. But to really get to know him. Let's hear his own words. I was born and dressed, quote, I was born and dressed in Germany, in the townhouse of our family, called the castle. But there was another castle, the Villa Cosel, out in the country, and it was there I grew up. This later manor had the reputation to be a haunted house, and the white woman whom my mother told me had appeared from time to time during the past 2 centuries was supposed to be my ancestor, the Countess Cosel, who died in 1767. Hers is quite a romantic history. Moreover, since her apparition to me was the beginning of my relationship to Elena, I will briefly narrate her story. So, Mr. Our good man, Carl, here begins to go and talk about the beginning of his oddness. You see, he was plagued with visions of the Countess Cosa. And as he put it, as a young boy, however, I had no interest in the family tree, and the existence of a ghost in the manor was never mentioned to me, nor entertained. True enough, at the age of 12, I had a dream, or rather a vision, of a very beautiful girl in a white dress, reclining on a rococo settee, which I painted on a piece of paper then. My boyish interests, however, entirely concentrated on electricity, on chemical experiments, and on flying machines, astronomy, in fact, of all phenomena of the universe. And as he puts, I had no interest outside music and paintings. Girls did not exist for me, I said formally, even as I went to the University of Leipzig, and I did neither smoke nor drink. Time seemed too precious to me for such pursuits of a monetary happiness. Engrossed in science after science I took, at the age of 24, final degrees as Masters of Arts in Medicine and Philosophy, Mathematics, Physics, Chemistry, etc., having passed 9 different examinations besides the SM. So, this is where we begin to see some of the odd thinking of Mr. Tanzler. You see, Tanzler, it's reported, had some book learning, but not as much book learning as he's talking. As a matter of fact, I actually went out of my way to go and see if I could find anything to go and prove what Tanzler was talking about. But sadly, I couldn't find any records on any of his academic pursuits. Not saying that the man didn't study, the possibility is there, but 9 degrees is doubtful. But now, you see, Tanzler was a man that didn't believe in the supernatural, at least in the beginning, until the visions came. Quote, I was sitting in my chair in the green room, piled on the large round table were writing materials from the college, books, and laboratory instruments. Over the table, there was hung a heavy kerosene lamp with a green shade, which cast a bright light. There were outlined the static machines and all the other equipment. Toward the back of the room was divided by a large curtain which enclosed my photographic darkroom, wherein I used to develop the X-ray pictures I made. All was bright behind the curtain, which I wanted to be very dark. To complete the picture, all doors, of which the green room had several, were locked, except the door to the adjoining music hall, which was furnished splendidly with a lit piano, an organ, chairs, chaise lounge, sets, Florentine table, life-size Venus de Milo, and an easel on which there stood a picture I once painted of Judith, the beautiful Jewess who slew Holofernes. Besides, there were several large oil paintings of Italian masters, in gold frames hanging on walls, also 10 feet high, mirrors and armor. The hour was late, about 11, I should say. I felt tired, but my day's work was not yet finished. Suddenly, without looking up from my papers, I noticed a movement near my side. It was a pencil lying on the table. It moved slowly across the table. As I looked at it straight, it stopped moving, but the moment I turned my eyes back to my work, I noticed from the corner of my eyes how I started again. Scientific training had taught me the first law and observance of phenomenon. Don't change any of the existing conditions. This, however, does not apply here. I merely paid little attention to it and kept bent on my work. He continues to go and mention how the papers began to fly off, lifted itself all over the floor, and floated upward as if carried by water. I was forced to get out of the chair and retreat a little for safety. The table weighed more than 200 pounds, and I was afraid to get crushed as it came down. You see, the table had begun to float. And as it continued, I had retreated to the neighborhood of the large curtain which screened my dark room. I almost touched the curtain when suddenly flames flared up and came running along the curtain's surface, gaining in intensity. Still more curious than frightened, I moved away and noticed how the flames crept to the ceiling and then went out. Yet there was no smoke, but there was the smell of burn, and as my fingers probed the curtain surface, they were darkened by ash. He continues to go and talk about how he was looking for answers. And he got upset to the point that he gathered a revolver. I opened its door, quote, I find one of my mercury pumps, which I kept there, smashed, and there's 50 pounds of mercury running over the floor, of which the splinters of glass floated. This was another heavy damage, running into hundreds of dollars. So my anger was aroused. If this is by any chance the spirit of the Countess Anna, who perpetrates all of this, please give me a prompt answer. But no answer would come. Later on that evening, he would be mysteriously awakened at around 2 a.m. Quote, I hardly believed my eyes. There were, however, standing by my bed 2 women. One bending over my face, a tall lady with snow-white hair, a striking likeness to the portrait of the Countess Anna, which I remembered so well. The second figure, which kept somewhat behind her, as if trying to hide, and the Countess held the reluctant younger lady by the hand. Bending still lower and staring at me, the Countess Anna addressed me as follows. I've been trying to attract your attention for quite some time, my boy, but you wouldn't take note. You were too much engrossed in your experiments. That's why I had to use some violence. Now take warning, do not entangle yourself with the women represented on the Judith picture. Don't get ensnared by her. She isn't the one who is destined for you. Look here, Carl. I have brought you the bride, who someday you will meet. I tried to answer something, but I could not speak. I had plenty of words, but I could not open my jaws. The Countess now stepped a little aside, and at the same time she drew her companion nearer to me. For a very brief moment, the veil parted from the shrouded figure's face. Spellbound, I saw framed in long, dark, black dresses, a young girl's face, so beautiful I can't attempt to describe it. For a fleeting second, I saw the girl smile at me, a wonderful smile. And at that moment, the Countess Anna detached herself from my arm. She had touched, and the apparition quite suddenly disappeared. You see, Carl believed that the Countess had come to him in a dream to show him his future wife, his one and only true beloved. Oddly enough, Carl would actually be married and have 2 children before meeting this supposed woman. But that's besides the point. Obsession and love, odd things, really. Now, he also goes and talks about how he visited the famous Camposanto, the gorgeous paradise of a cemetery behind the city of Genoa. He did a lot of traveling for quite a while, and there he speaks of, there, quote, all of a sudden, I found myself in front of an exquisite marble statue of an extremely beautiful girl and was frozen in my steps because there was the most striking resemblance to the apparition of my promised bride. Why, here she is in stone, I said to myself. How very strange. Why could not God grant it to me that I should meet her in the flesh instead? Why is it that I must find her only as an effigy standing on a grave? I was moved deeply because of its minute executed lifelike resemblance. As I stood there, I felt tears welling up in my eyes, a fact which embarrassed me, because there were so many visitors around. But obviously, all those sightseers were under the impression that I was a mourner, as indeed I was, and nobody paid any attention to me. Thus, I stood in front of the statue for quite some time. All I could learn was that this beautiful girl had died at the age of 22, and that her name had been Elena. And if I remember a spell, I kept repeating the name Elena, Elena. And it was then all of a sudden, the figure of a live girl in the same white dress seemed to detach itself from the statue. I slowly walked past where I stood looking at me. Carl seems to be suffering from illusions. He he was never truly diagnosed. Sadly, especially due to the era that this was happening in, there wasn't much information about conditions like his. But you'll see as we continue to kind of go into it, what I'm reading for you here is printed by a journal. And after this incident with Elena, it's very fantastical. You see that there will be lots of flowery language because it's coming from the mind of a deluded individual. Do I believe that Carl saw these things? I believe that Carl believed that he did. I believe that Tanzler truly believed that he was having visions from ghosts and from the beyond. Now, are they real visions? Probably not. But they are there nonetheless. Now, after many travels, quote, after many travels in many a land, I finally settled down after fashion Sydney, Australia, 13 years before the outbreak of the First World War. You see, Carl would actually wind up in an internment camp for quite some time during the break of World War One, which is always a little odd. But that's a whole different story to go and talk about. But as we continue to go and talk about the apparitions that show up, I point out this one because this one's actually kind of important. In the evening of March 7th, 1912, Carl writes, and I quote, "It was exactly 7 p.m. when all of a sudden there was the end of the roar of the storm and sea. Glancing across the table, I noticed a white veiled form standing on the threshold of my door, facing me. My mouth still full of food, I continued eating, too amused to do anything else. At first I thought my eyes deceived me, but the apparition stood there all right. After looking a second, the third time, there could be no doubt about its reality. It was a woman about my own size, and I noted the rich black hair unrolling over her shoulders, showing through the veils. So long it reached down to her knees. Even through the veil I could see dark eyes which fixedly stared at me. I also noticed the light from out in the hall faintly showed through her form. A tremble of supreme joy and anxiety shook my frame. There she was at last, the apparition of Castle Corcel, my promised bride. Now, Tanzler would continue moving around. He would continue going out and about in the world. And like I said, he would get married. He would go and have 2 children. He spent some time in Havana in Cuba, and he also kind of speaks about how he doesn't want to pay attention to anyone in the carnival. He doesn't want to pay attention to any other women. No. He knows who he was promised. And somehow, some way, he winds up in Florida, in Key West, Florida. So in truth, we are speaking about a story of a Florida man. For those of you who know the meme, I don't. Oh God, I warn all of you. If you think it's weird now, it's getting there. As you see, Carl at first was working as a cleanup guy, as the janitor in this hospital for some time. But you know, speaking to everyone that was there and stuff like that, and to the head of the hospital, he was working at the Marine Hospital at Key West. And somehow he winds up getting employed as a pathologist and x ray specialist. In his mind, he's an x ray specialist. He's pretty much just a technician. And as he puts it, quote, I built up a fairly well equipped x ray department and peace of mind in scientific work until the fateful day of April 22nd, 1930. In the middle of my routine work, I received a call from the head office to go and take a blood test from a young senorita who was an outpatient who had come for examination. I hardly looked at the patient as I entered the room. The first thing I noticed of her personality, as I bent down to take a drop of blood from her fingertips, rather than one of her ears, which were too exquisitely lovely to mar, was that her hand was unusually small, its long, tapering fingers the loveliest I had ever seen. As the needle struck, the hand twitched a little, and it was then that from my kneeling position I raised my head for the first time to say, "I'm very sorry to have caused you pain. Forgive me, please." Her face had been hidden by her hand, so that I hardly seen it as I first entered the room. But now she withdrew her hand to answer me, and I looked into a face of unearthly beauty, the face of my dreams and visions, the face of the bride that had been promised to be by my ancestor 40 years before. Karl Tanzler has met Maria Elena. Elena Maria, forgive me. Ooh. Forget there's so much name. There's so much name to this poor girl. Maria Elena de Milagro. We're just going to call her Maria for now. And forgive me, I have Miss Peaches here saying hi. Hi, baby. Hello. Hello, my little detective cat. Yes. So you see, this is where it all starts. On this day, Carl meets Maria. And as he goes and he takes this little blood test and all that, he goes off and he speaks about how her voice was soft and sweet and childlike, reminded me of a mockingbird song in spring. She spoke with a Spanish accent, yet her English was cultured and quite good. Having performed the duty for which I had been called, I had no excuse to stay any longer in the room. Feeling very shaky, I rose, and much too confused to say anything, I merely bowed myself out, not knowing whether I was walking or dreaming. Back in my lab, I sat for quite a while, lost in the memory of the apparition in the old castle, and in Campo Santa, and above all my 7 days with her in Sydney, Australia, at the time of my father's death. Yes, it was she whom at last I found in the flesh, for proof that she was really alive. I held in the hand a little glass tube with a drop of her red blood. A nurse brought me the record sheet for me to enter the results of my test. There was nothing much the matter with her blood, but it gave me a shock to read at the top of the record sheet that Mrs. before the name Elena Hoyos. So she belonged to somebody else. Just let's catch that for a second. She belonged to somebody else. Yes. For, she's someone else's property. Ay. Anyways. So, a nurse brought me the record. Forgive me. So, was there a curse upon me that after this search for 4 decades had come to an end, I should lose her again at the very moment I had finally discovered her, my promised bride? You see, Maria had been married, and she was still actively married when they first met. She was married on February 18th, 1926, and to a Luis Mesa, the son of Caridad and Isaac Mesa. But Luis would actually leave Maria shortly after Maria would have a miscarriage of the couple's child and moving to Miami. The couple would stay legally married until Elena's death. Now, over all these, as he says, over all these years, what was there in a husband's name or even in a husband's existence? All this had very little to do with me and Elena. The main thing was I had found her and that she was ill and I was best qualified in a position to help her. You see, he realized that Elena was sick with tuberculosis. And at the time, it was incurable. There was really no way to stop it. Tuberculosis was a death sentence. It would later on be the thing to go and claim the life, I believe, of her mother and father during that time as well. But Carl can't really hold himself. Elena and the mother actually notice that he's watching a little bit too much and he's getting involved in a lot of things. And he continues to go and speak about how he wants to go and spend time with her, and how he's trying to go and dote over her. And there's a moment that, as he writes, quote, "It was probably only human that this fact filled my heart with joy." You see, Elena and her husband had separated, as he had been responsible for her suffering. Also filled me with deep pity when tears welled up in my beautiful eyes of in the beautiful eyes of my Elena.